thank you to Sami and Tech Nation for having Business Declares today to speak to your net zero cohort. Absolute pleasure to be speaking to startups who are really going to be helping with the much needed climate solutions to help us get where we need to be in the next 10 years. I'm not going to speak for very long because we have an action-packed schedule, lots of amazing people to get through. And so if we just want to move on to the next slide, I'm just going to give a really quick overview. We're here to talk about simple steps that can be taken. And amazing from the poll to hear quite a lot of you already feel that you're on this. But while you may be looking at climate solutions through your business, most important.
So what Ricardo said, he can't budge on the 1.5%, did he say, on the affordable side?
Oh, you need to mute someone, I think.
All right, fine.
I'll try and continue. So the most important thing as well is to embed these things into your organizations early. And I think you probably know the benefits of it. And the reason we want to talk to you today is really to help you see that these steps can be taken at an early stage in your organization rather than the need to retrofit in the future. So if we just move on, and rightly, as this is Tech Nation, and my understanding is most of your startups are digital. We really felt that this could be the focus for today's session. I mean, obviously, there's the exponential growth in the digital carbon footprint, even more so since COVID and the home working and the proliferation of home working. We hear a number of small organizations saying, well, I don't have a big physical footprint, I'm working from home. And hopefully we'll really address the need for everybody to do what they can where they are to address their climate impact. And I think also the digital carbon emissions really haven't had a great amount of exposure or understanding. So really, we just thought we'd go out to 3 founders, now CEOs of their companies, who've made it happen in their organization and can really hopefully bring it to life as to what is possible. And I'll just go through the agenda just so that you know what's coming up. So yeah, in our Inspiring Action, we will start with Ben Tolhurst, also director at Business Declares. He'll give you just a background of the work that we do, but also his personal journey, which is really fantastic. We then have CEO and co-founder Tom Greenwood talking about what it really means to run a sustainable business and the journey that they've taken to do this. And then we have Will Richardson from Compare Your Footprint, really getting into the detail of how you can embed this into the heart of your organization from the early stages. And then it becomes just part of what you do on a regular basis. And then we go back to Tom and we get really into the detail of digital design and what it means. And we can just point you to our new Business Declares and whole grain digital toolkit, which is going to really hopefully help people look at the simple steps that they can take. And then we move to Reem by Wendy, who is up very early. She's in Canada, so a special thank you to Reem. And really, again, bringing to life why, just because you may have a small team working from home, just how important it is that all of us help our employees and ourselves to do what we can. And then hopefully we'll have 30 minutes left at the end for Q&A. But I really would really urge you all to put any questions you've got into the chat through the presentations while you think of them. We've got a team of us here to help answer those questions as we're ongoing, but then also the questions that need fleshing out, or the best questions, Ben will then be bringing to the panel at the end and allowing our panel to speak to those. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand you over to the fantastic Ben Tolhurst.
Thank you very much, Sam, and welcome everyone. It's great to see so many people here online today. Thank you for giving up your time to join this session. So yeah, I'm Ben Tolhurst. My day job is UK Board Director for JLL. JLL is a huge global property management organisation, and my background really is in outsourcing generally, where I've worked with a lot of FTSE 100s, either as a direct employee or a consultant or an outsourced provider. I've also worked with some very small organisations of 2 and 3 people. So I do get what it's like to be in a small business as well. But in my capacity today, I am representing Business Declares, which I joined around a year and a half ago. And I guess, you know, I had what I can only describe as a climate epiphany back in February 2019. And without going into too much detail, I had this kind of massive wake-up call and realised that I needed to do something different. And within 9 months, I'd gone vegan, I had decarbonised my pension, I'd stopped flying, I'd stopped buying stuff. I had developed a climate science pack, which I then delivered to maybe 300, 400, 500 people in my organisation, as well as client organisations, and a whole load of other stuff. And as part of that journey, I really wanted to do something in the voluntary, not-for-profit sector, and that kind of led me into Business Declares. So that's a brief intro to me. In terms of Business Declares and a brief intro to us, we're a not-for-profit organisation, and we recognise that business has a massive part to play in tackling climate and ecological and society breakdown, that crisis that we're in the midst of right now. And we really, Business Declares exists to raise awareness, firstly, of this agenda right across the business sector, and most importantly, to accelerate action in tackling this issue. Sorry, I should have moved slides. There we go. And so how do we do this? Well, we do this in a number of ways. So firstly, we operate as a convener of dialogues. So as we are doing today, bringing together lots of different organisations with a common challenge to explore and learn from each other. We also do this by acting as an agitator, as well as a critical business friend, to explore some edgy dilemmas. So, for example, Scope 3 emissions, for example, how to actually start the process of understanding where you are on your carbon journey. How do you do all that stuff? So we would mobilise around a particular problem. And then the final thing is around sharing thought leadership and good practice. There is a lot of thought leadership and good practice out there. The problems that people are facing are common problems, and there is somebody somewhere who's facing it alongside you guys, and there will be some answers out there. So thought leadership and sharing. So that's what it is to be part of our network. And I suppose our ultimate aim in life is to create the conditions by which it becomes actually mainstream that businesses fully grasp the urgency and impact of the climate, ecological and societal breakdown that we're in, and adopt new ways of working, adopt new business models, and those are governed by transparent plans. So please do contact me or any of the team afterwards about joining Business Declares, becoming part of our network of businesses which stand together, which learn and share together, and which take positive action to make a contribution to the crisis that we're in. There is no charge, by the way, for joining Business Declares. We're a not-for-profit organisation, although we do look for donations for things like website maintenance, etc. In terms of who is in our network, there's around about 40 different organisations. You can see just a few of them there. We've got a whole range of industries, from the legal industry with Bates Wells, the energy industry with Ecotricity, the retail industry, Body Shop and People Tree, etc. So a great range of organisations that come together around shared challenges. Okay, that's enough for me. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Tom, who has in fact 2 slots today. You have a double dose of Tom. Tom is managing director and co-founder of Whole Grain Digital. And just by quick way of intro, Tom is has been active in sustainable design since the early 2000s. He created the first online design guide. And a little bird tells me, Tom, that there is a book being launched this month on sustainable web design. So, Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so Whole Grain Digital is a company that I run. It's a web design and development agency that's very much focused on sort of sustainability and social justice. And we've been going since 2007, so 14 years now. And very much from the beginning of it, one of the reasons we wanted to start the company was actually sort of an experiment to find out whether business really can be sustainable, very much aligned with what Business Declares stands for, but to run it as a real life experiment and sort of put my own money where my mouth was, rather than saying business is the problem, to say no, business can be the solution. So we've been doing that for 14 years, and in the next sort of 12, 15 minutes, I'm just going to run through some of the things that we've done over the years to try and take on that challenge, particularly in regard to sort of carbon emissions and climate change. So I'm not going to go through everything that we've done, but I'll go through a few highlights. So if we move on to the next slide, to just give you a bit of context to who we are. So we're a digital service business. So obviously, we don't have to deal with some of the complexities that other companies do in terms of like manufacturing and transporting products and so on. It's all digital, but I think that's aligned with many people on this call. We're a small business, so depending on which year you're looking at, sort of 15 to 20 employees. And yes, let's move on to the next slide, and I'll start talking through the things that we've been looking at over the years. So one of the first things that we looked at years ago in terms of reducing our carbon footprint was office energy. It sort of occurred to us straight away that sort of office space is not just expensive, but the more you've got, the more energy it uses. So we actually started using sort of collaborative shared workspaces over a decade ago when they were still quite a new concept, and it's worked really well for us. But one of the challenges we found is that by working in shared spaces, you get two problems. One is that you don't have control over the energy bills, and two, you don't have any data about the energy necessarily. So we've always tried to sort of shop around and find a workspace that actually kind of aligns with our own ethos, and that therefore they've already made the commitment themselves to use renewable energy to power the workspace. And that's like it's a hard criteria for us, that we won't move in unless they meet that criteria. But then getting the actual data for like the energy that we're using as a team in terms of how much of that space are we using has been a challenge. One of our earlier workspaces actually opened up and like gave us all of the data for the energy bills and the contract for the electricity supplier, and that was all like super helpful. Then a few years ago, we moved to a different workspace where that information was not available. It's not through lack of goodwill, it was, the organization's not really geared up for it. So that creates some challenges in terms of like, how do we actually account for our own emissions, but also in terms of things like B Corp assessment. We're certified B Corp, providing evidence that our office space uses renewable energy. If we don't have the energy bills and we don't have a way of getting a copy of them, then we can't submit that as evidence. So there are challenges in shared workspaces, but I think in general, it's something interesting to explore in terms of more efficient use of buildings. And I think that's really the key thing, and putting pressure on these shared working spaces to actually use renewable energy, super important. If we move on to the next slide, one of the biggest things we've done, the single biggest thing we've done to reduce our carbon emissions as a company was to introduce a no-fly policy. And we did this, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago. And the image on the right is actually a German campaign to get companies to do this. And you can use Google Translate, translate it into English, but it's got some really good information on there to kind of guide you through what to think about. And they've got different tiers. So you have like a blanket no-fly policy, or you could have a policy that says, okay, we won't fly to neighboring countries, for example, or we won't use internal flights. So there's sort of different levels that you could apply depending on what fits for your business. But we just really started with the question, like, why do we fly? Are there alternatives, and can we stop? And these 3 questions basically led us to the conclusion that as a digital service business, the reasons that we fly are all non-essential. Some of them could be classified as jollies, and and the ones that are actually like genuinely business related, it's like, well, a lot of it we could do by video calls, or if it's neighboring countries, we can take the train, which we have done over the last few years. We've done some international travel via train, and it's worked really well. So that's a really key thing to think about. If, just ask yourself the hard question, like how much of our flying is really, really essential, and could we introduce some sort of policy to limit that? If we go on to the next slide, Ben. This is one I'm just going to flag up as something we've tried that didn't work. So we introduced a carbon tax, I think 4 years ago, and at the time we looked at sort of EU guidance on this, and it was about £30 a tonne. And the idea is that basically you kind of, if in the absence of governments introducing a carbon tax, you say to yourselves, well, okay, well, we'll just kind of create an internal market where high carbon activities are more expensive and therefore we're less likely to do them. And I think the reason I put it here is I think that for some organizations this could really work. For us as a small business where the key kind of purchasing decisions are made by a couple of people, including me, and where the money from our own internal carbon tax was going towards a climate change charity. So actually, in a way, we didn't mind spending that money. It meant that the incentives weren't really aligned with the behaviors we were trying to create. But I do think that in some organizations, this could be a really interesting idea where you've got like departmental budgets, for example, and they want to make the most of those budgets, then this sort of carbon tax could actually be quite effective. If we move on to the next slide. And one thing I'd just say as well is that I'll share these slides afterwards, and I've got links to some sort of related reading materials on a lot of these that are linked at the bottom of each slide. So I mentioned using a sort of shared workspace, but the other side of the same coin, and particularly over the past 12 months, has been home working. And that creates another challenge because I think a lot of businesses in the past have not really accounted for the energy and the emissions of home working. We've been trying to do it for a few years, and we've found it quite challenging. How do you know how much energy is being used? How do you quantify whether that energy is actually extra energy that wouldn't have been used if they were not at home? And is that even something worth talking about? And then there's a privacy issue about if we want to gather this data from people's homes, do they have to give us that data or not? What we've kind of found is that actually just making it voluntary, but really making the case to everybody in the team of why this is important has been quite effective. And we get most people are quite happy to share the data from their energy bills so that we can actually include it in our carbon accounting. But for anybody that doesn't feel comfortable, that's fine. There's no pressure. We just use an average of everybody else to account for them. But the single biggest thing we've done here to make a change is introduce a renewable energy incentive. So several years ago, we introduced an incentive where you could either get £200 for switching to a renewable energy supplier at home, or you could get an extra day of annual leave for having renewable energy at home. What we found was that it was a very kind of slow takeoff for this. And initially not many people actually made the switch, but the main barrier seems to be that people think that switching energy suppliers is really, really difficult. And once a couple of people had done it, it suddenly snowballed. And now 100% of our team have renewable energy tariffs at home. And out of 18 people that currently work in our team, only 4 people had renewable energy tariffs at home prior to being offered this incentive. So that's 14 people that have switched because of it. And they've all switched for the annual leave. £200, no one really seemed to care. It wasn't worth the hassle, or they didn't think it was worth the hassle. But an extra day of holiday every year, that seems worth making the switch for. So this has really made a big difference, and I think it's probably one of the most successful initiatives. So definitely something that I'd recommend considering. If we move to the next slide, just one quick thing, climate perks. We really tried to look outside of what we're doing as a company and look at the team as a group of individuals. And one thing we found is that actually a big part of our carbon footprint is not just the business operations, but people flying on holiday. So we've got a team of people who are really kind of passionate about climate change, and then we all go off on holiday on an airplane. And it's somewhat contradictory. So we introduced climate perks, which is run by a charity called Possible, and it's basically kind of a scheme whereby you get extra time for traveling by train or by bus for international holidays each year. And I think it's a good scheme to look at if you just look up climateperks.com. If we move to the next slide. So just a couple of ongoing challenges that we've got. We go on to the first one of these. We wanted to try and build our own renewables. It's one thing like signing up for your renewable energy tariffs, but what we wanted to do as a company was actually say we've added enough capacity to the grid to supply our own energy. Problem is we don't have our own roof or land. So we actually teamed up with a charity, and we found a space in London, a community space where we could actually build a little solar farm. And we did this as a team building project, and we funded it. And that was really, really exciting. In the end, it failed miserably because of a dispute with the landlord. And it sadly ended up having to be dismantled. But nevertheless, this is something we want to still do, and we're sort of looking at for the future. I think it's a nice idea to think about by actually contributing capacity, not just buying energy. So if we go to the next slide, and commuting, obviously this year has been a massive impact. We found that even with our no-fly policy, we travel 120,000 kilometers a year as a team. That's a long way, and 95% of it's commuting. A lot of our team, even though we're a London-based agency, don't live in central London. They live like out in the home counties, or even further afield in some cases. So COVID-19, where we've been mostly working from home, has reduced our emissions by 40%, and we factored into that the additional impact of video calls. So that's a huge reduction, and we thought that we was like kind of struggling to reduce our emissions after all the other things we've done, and then this showed us how much we could do even further. So another challenge for like looking ahead is when things go back more to normal, how do we try to retain these kind of carbon savings, but also get the benefits of human contact and so on that we used to have. If we could go to the next slide, then heating is another challenge. Gas boilers inherently run on fossil fuels. We don't have a solution to that now, so I'm just putting it out there that this is something that is hard to solve as a business. Next slide. And purchases. This is really difficult. Maybe, I don't know whether Compare Your Footprint will talk about this, but there's lots of little things we buy that are really hard to deal with in terms of carbon emissions. The only thing we've really taken a stand on is like IT equipment, and have a policy for buying refurbished. That IT equipment has a huge carbon footprint. So buying refurbished equipment is a good step, but all the little things are really hard to tackle. Next slide. And so finally, if we just look at what we're doing to calculate an offset, on the next slide, we've been doing this in a spreadsheet, and this is partly because we wanted to learn and like tailor things to ourselves. We've been doing this for about 4 or 5 years, and you can find the spreadsheet on the link at the bottom of the slide. But this year, I think we really want to move to a software. The spreadsheet works, and it's relatively simple. You can use the template that we've got online, and it's good to learn. But I think, ultimately, a nice user interface and simplicity is going to make our lives a lot easier, and especially with time being a barrier. And then the final thing is just offsetting. We're looking at drawdown versus reduction. So for us, like drawing emissions out of the atmosphere, to us is a priority over just like reducing other people's emissions in offsetting schemes. We like to look at timeframes. So if you're doing things like tree planting, are the emissions reductions happening this year, in the year that we emitted, or are they happening over the next 25, 30 years? So actually synchronizing the drawdown in the same sort of time frame as the emissions, to us, is something that we think is really important to think about. And then looking at credibility of the schemes we're using, and some challenges for the future, like historical emissions. We'd like to do something about it. We haven't figured out how to do that. And our Green Handshake is a scheme where we plant 1,260 trees when somebody joins our team, which roughly, on an annual basis, once they get going, draw down roughly the amount of emissions of an average UK person. So it's just sort of a Green Handshake for somebody to join the whole green team. I think that's the end of my first presentation, but hopefully it's given you a good flavor of like the sorts of things that we've done on an operational level as a business to reduce our emissions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. That was really insightful. I love the I guess the detail, the nitty gritty. I mean, this stuff just means you have to deal with detail, doesn't it? And
Absolutely.
you got right into that. I also thought the voluntary carbon tax. I've not come across that before. I'm really that was a really bold move. I know you said it probably didn't work, but the fact that you actually tried it, and I'm sure you'll try it again, and we'll find a way. But yeah, calculating the externalities of what you do and paying for them in a carbon tax thing is a really bold move. So I'm very interested in that. Thank you. Let us move on to our next speaker. Can I just remind everybody that we do have a chat function for any Q&A, which we are reviewing as we go through. So please don't forget to put any questions in there, either directed at an individual or indeed generalities. Let me now introduce Will Richardson of Green Element and Compare Your Footprints. Will is a pioneer, an early adopter of many now mandatory environmental standards, and his visionary approach and inspiring leadership is exemplary. That's what they say, Will. Will's going to talk about Compare Your Footprints, and over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you. Great, great intro. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you so much for listening today. I think that what Tom has gone through is absolutely spot on, because it is what can you do to reduce your environmental footprint. And what I'm going to be going through is how to actually measure it and the sort of things that you can do to measure that footprint. If you could go on to the next slide, please, Ben. So our journey to net zero, I set up Green Element in 2004 to help organisations and equip them to get towards a more sustainable future. 14 years later, I launched Compare Your Footprints in 2018, which I'll talk about a bit later. Green Element became one of the first certified B Corps back in 2015, alongside Tom at Whole Digital, actually. And we felt it aligned with our ethos and helped to put a stronger foundation in place, which has supported a sustainable growth. We're in the business of helping other organisations to become more sustainable, so it's important to lead by example. So how do we do it? Well, firstly, we became a B Corp, which completely changed the way that our organization.
I think we may have lost Will. Can anybody, I presume people can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Will, can you hear us?
I think Will jinxed it, didn't he? He said he was scared this would happen.
He did.
So what I suggest, unless Liberty, you want to come in here, what I suggest is we go back to Tom and then come back to Will when he rejoins. Is everybody okay with that? Or
yeah, that makes sense. And if he doesn't come back, I can then take over. But I think
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So Tom, you're on again, a little bit ahead of time, but over to you.
Okay, so this is the sort of the more practical digital side of things. So I understand that a lot of people here are working in organizations that produce digital products and services. So I'm just going to go through some key things to think about. Obviously, I can't go through everything today, but just to kind of whet your appetite as to what the impact of digital is and some of the key actions that you can take to address it. If we go to the next slide. So the first thing to sort of do is just put on your radars that internet emissions are huge. A lot of people don't really know anything about the carbon footprint of the internet and digital services. And part of the reason for that is that it's not really talked about openly, and it's invisible. It all happens behind the scenes. You don't have exhaust pipes on your laptops, and you don't really see data centers, for example. They're anonymous warehouses on industrial estates that you'd never even know were there, and they don't have big chimneys or anything coming out of the top. But the internet carbon footprint is roughly equivalent to Germany, which is currently, I think, the 7th most polluting country in the world. So it's a huge impact. And in terms of total emissions, it's also roughly equivalent to the global aviation industry pre-pandemic. So currently it'll actually, with the pandemic, it will have overtaken aviation, as aviation's obviously reduced and internet usage has increased rapidly over the past 12 months. So we often think about the aviation industry as being this sort of, like bad boy of climate change. But actually, lots of industries have a surprisingly big impact, and the digital sector is one of those that is very much kind of flying under the radar. If we go to the next slide. So this is just for websites, but websitecarbon.com is a tool that we developed a few years back that you can use for free, just to kind of get a rough idea of the impact of different web pages. But an average website produces about 1.7 grams of CO2 per page view, and that's factoring in various different criteria of what happens when somebody visits a page and repeat page views and so on. But that's a small amount, but it scales up. A lot of websites have thousands, tens of thousands, even millions of page views per month. So once you start scaling these things up, you can actually result with quite big amounts of CO2. And so scale is really the name of the game. And it's really, things that sound small can have a surprisingly big impact. If we go to the next slide, this impact essentially comes from three places. And this is true for any type of digital services, not just websites. It's the data centers, which is where the information is stored and processed. It's the transmission networks that send the data around the world from the data center to the end user and back again. And the data can be traveling anything from tens of miles to thousands of miles for each interaction. And then the end user devices, which obviously the phones, computers, are all using electricity. The fourth thing, which is not on this slide, is the embodied energy of actually manufacturing and maintaining all of this infrastructure, which is actually also in itself huge. And we're constantly replacing equipment. For example, data center servers get replaced about every 3 years. And there's millions of servers being used in operation at any one time. But the good news is that essentially it all runs on electricity. So unlike the aviation industry, where they've got this huge problem of like, how do we decarbonize flight when the only way of really running commercial airlines is by burning jet fuel, the internet runs on electricity. So it can be run entirely on renewables. And that's really kind of the great opportunity that we have as an industry. So if we move to the next slide, I'm going to go through some top tips for embedding sustainable principles into digital projects. So the first one is streamlining user journeys. And this is something that I think is it's just good design anyway. It's good user experience and there's no downside to it. But basically, the longer people have to take to find something, the more pages they have to visit to do it, the more energy is going to be consumed. So optimizing user journeys is not just good for, it's not just good for profits and user experience, it's also good for the environment. I've got a picture of Finisterre here. They've got a nice example on their website of how they've reduced user journeys with their shopping basket. A lot of e-commerce sites have a what I call like a yo-yo user journey, where you want to buy a few different things from the same shop. You put a couple of things in your basket. You can't remember what you put in the basket. So you go to the cart page, have a look, and you come back to the shop, browse around. You've forgotten what's in your basket again. You keep going to the cart and back and cart and back. On Finisterre website, they have this little pull out on the side and you can just see it at any time. That's what's in my basket. I never need to go to the cart page. And when I'm ready, I just click checkout. So it's really, really good user experience. And it's also very efficient. We move on to the next one. Images and making images efficient. So images are like on most websites, in the absence of video, they're the single biggest thing in terms of like file size and data that has to be transferred. So designing things so that they need less images. So using color and shape and texture instead of photographs can be a really good way of improving efficiency. Using vector graphics, which designers will be familiar with, but using them on the internet means that you can make big shapes with very, very tiny files because you don't have to store all of the pixel data that you'd have in a photograph. And then designing the smallest version of your photos. And if we go on to the next slide, I'll show you some examples of what I mean by this. So, you know, a lot of websites, you land on the website, the first thing you see is like a full screen background image. It fills the whole screen. And it can be great. It can be like, you know, create a good emotional connection with you the first time you land. But it also has a huge file size. So this image filling the screen, 1.2 megabytes as a JPEG. If we move on to the next one, we can see that if we halve the dimensions, we actually reduce the size to 360 kilobytes, 70% smaller. And if you design this well with kind of shape and color around it, you could actually have a similarly good impact, but reduce the file size by 70%. But the one on the right is interesting because the edge of the image is blurred. It's the same photo, the edge of the image is blurred. And it's then 47% smaller again. And the reason is that detail in photographs is what contributes to file size. It's basically just more and more information. So the simpler the images, the smaller the files. So as designers, thinking about how we can use shallow depth of field or cut out images and put them on like solid color backgrounds and things is a really nice way of making things beautiful, but also really, really efficient. And if we move on to the next one, black and white, again, we can reduce the file size even further because color detail is just another type of information that has to be stored in the file. So if you can use black and white imagery as an aesthetic, you know, advantage, if you can actually make it work and make it beautiful, that's another way of making things really efficient. And then if we move on to the next one, you can then use more efficient file formats. So most people are familiar with JPEGs, and JPEGs are sort of generally considered to be more efficient than things like PNG files for photographs. But WebP is a web-specific file format that's far more efficient than JPEG, and it's supported by most web browsers. So, and there's a new one coming called AVIF. So if you're a tech company and you're looking at what you're doing over the next 12 to 18 months, look at AVIF format as well, which is about half the size again of WebP. So you can make images that look super high quality, high definition. You can make them look, you can make the files really, really, really tiny. So, you know, just as a WebP, you know, the final black and white one is 96% smaller than the original image I showed you, which effectively is a 96% reduction in data transfer and energy use. So that's amazing. If we move on from here, I mentioned if you don't use video, images are probably the biggest impact. If you do use video, video consumes huge amount of data and therefore energy and carbon emissions. So, I mean, the top tip for video is try to avoid autoplay. Autoplay means that the video is going to play in the background as soon as somebody loads that page or that app. And the thing about autoplay is it's not just bad for the environment, it burns through people's data. So there's a sort of social justice issue here that people with pay-as-you-go plans on low incomes, they load a page before they even know what's happening. You're just churning through their data. So giving them the ability to opt in is much better user experience, it's much fairer, and it's better for the environment. And then just look at, you know, is video the best format? Can we make the videos shorter? Can we optimize the file format? So MPEG-4 is generally the most efficient video format for using on the internet. And video is often much more efficient than animated GIFs. So GIFs have kind of come back in fashion, and they're really like low quality, but really massive files. So it's kind of the worst of both worlds. So if you can use video instead, even if it still looks like a GIF, but you've just saved it as a MPEG-4, you have much smaller files. So that's something to do. If we move on to the next one. So fonts are something to think about. So most people sort of don't really think about the fonts that are used on a website, but there's two types of fonts and they have different impacts. System fonts are the ones that are already loaded onto your machine. So they're on your laptop, they're on your phone, and no data has to be downloaded in order to display that font. So it's things like Arial, Times New Roman, Roboto on Android phones. And they're not always the most beautiful, but they can be really functional and they're basically free in terms of data. So hotels.com is a great example where they only use system fonts. And, you know, obviously they're a successful business, and they've got away without using any custom fonts. And the good thing about that is that it also makes their website faster, which is probably why they've made that choice, because it's reducing the amount of data transfer. If we move on to the next one, if you are using custom fonts, then there's a lot of things you can do to optimize them. So I'm just going to use this example. Into UI is a really popular open source font, really beautiful. And it comes as a file format called TTF. As standard, it has 2,192 characters in the font file. It comes in 39 languages. There are 9 weights of the font. And you have to download each weight of the font as a different file. So each file is 300 kilobytes. If you had all 9 weights, it'd be 9 times 300 kilobytes, which is much bigger than an entire web page should be if you used all of them. So if we move to the next slide, I think on the next slide I've got an example. We can really cut this down just by thinking carefully about what we do and we don't include. So we can firstly reduce the number of variants. So you might only need 1 weight, don't use all 9. But then we can also do what's called subsetting of font. And we can also change the file format to a file format called WAF2, which is like the WebP of fonts. It's just much more efficient, smaller files. But subsetting fonts is basically where you strip out all the characters that you're never going to use. And there's websites that can automatically do this for you. So you put in the languages that you're going to use, like English, French, and it will just strip out all the other characters. So when we do this, if we just put in English on Into UI, we end up with 98 characters instead of 2,192. And a file format of 12 kilobytes instead of 298, which is incredible. And then when we convert that to WAF2 format, we get it from 12 kilobytes down to 7 kilobytes. So it's nearly a 98% reduction in file size. And yet to the end user, this font looks exactly the same. They will never know any difference. And it just shows it's digital waste. If you think of this unnecessary data as waste, and what we're trying to do is create a zero waste digital experience. And we can reduce it by 98% here. If we move on, so this tip, go easy on the icing. I'm talking about all the little extra things that you have on a website, like little animations and things that happen when you interact with something. And all of this stuff can be really beautiful in terms of user experience. And I'm not going to say don't do it, but what you can do is just like ask yourself the hard questions about, like, does this really make the user experience better? Is it really useful? And what's the energy impact, and is there a more efficient way? And the screenshot on the right is from the Safari browser. Safari browser has developer tools, and it's the only browser that has an energy impact tool, which is the dial in the middle of the screen of the image. And basically you can load a page and it will give you the energy impact. So what you can do is you can experiment by trying different like animation effects on a page, and then run the energy impact tool to see how much energy that's using on the end user's computer. So when you hear the fans whirring on your laptop or your mobile phone is getting really, really hot, that's because it's got like super high energy impact. And what you want to be aiming for is like really beautiful effects that have a really low energy impact. So this is just something to experiment with and learn what works. If we move to the next one, low energy colors. So this is more and more relevant as more and more devices move to OLED screens. So for sort of typical LCD screens that we had in the past, it didn't really make any difference. But OLED screens, which you get on nearly all smartphones now, a lot of TVs now, a lot of laptops now, they basically light up every individual pixel. It's like a tiny microscopic individual light bulb. So what that means is that a white page means that every light bulb is switched on to maximum brightness. And a black page means all the light bulbs are switched off, which saves energy. And then, every color in between is somewhere in between. The darker it is, the less energy it's using. And the only exception to that really is blue, which for some reason Google found that it uses about 25% more than red and green pixels. So white and blue color schemes, which ironically this slide is like very white and blue, are the most energy intensive. So just think about that. Obviously, you've got to follow your own brand guidelines, but there's a lot of things you can do in design to reduce the amount of white, reduce the amount of blue, and shift towards a darker palette. If we move on, Tracking is a big issue. So particularly for media websites, the tracking scripts can be more in terms of both file size and processing energy than the rest of the website or web servers put together. And it slows down things, it invades people's privacy, it can ruin user experience. And I'm not saying don't track anything. I'm just saying, like, use tracking really mindfully. Like, ask yourself, like, do we really need to track this? Is it the most efficient way of gathering the data that we need? Is it respecting people's privacy? And what you'll end up with is faster websites, less invasive like privacy messages, and much reduced energy impact. So use tracking mindfully, definitely a big thing. If we move on to the next one, and this is sort of for a lot of projects, this is probably the lowest hanging fruit. I left it to last. Use green hosting. So switching hosting for a lot of projects is actually quite an easy job to do. The Green Web Foundation has a database of all of the IP addresses of hosting companies that have actually made a commitment to using green energy in their data centers. So you can run your own web address or any other web address through their tool and find out whether it's in a data center that's got a green energy commitment. Or you can also use their directory to find hosting providers that have made that commitment so that you can make an informed choice about who you're going with. And things to think about with hosting is location. So locate your servers close to your users so there's less data transfer. You know, there's no point having your servers hosted in Dallas, Texas, if everybody who's using it is in the UK. It's much better to have it in the UK so you don't have to transfer all that data thousands of miles across the Atlantic. Efficiency, so there's lots of things that basically anything on the server that makes your website faster is probably going to save energy because it's reducing the amount of processing that has to be done. So there's lots of technical considerations there, but renewable energy is kind of the easy win. And the only challenge to that is if you're using something like AWS, Amazon Web Services, and you're hooked into their native tools, you're kind of locked in without rebuilding your servers. So if that is the case, then my recommendation would be to look at Amazon's commitment to renewable energy and find out which data centers they've actually started moving on to renewable energy supplies, and see if you can move on to that's relatively local, that's got renewable energy supply. And that's a relatively easy win. And then the next one is my blatant plug for my book, which came out 2 weeks ago on sustainable web design and covers a lot of this stuff in a bit more detail, and also the more of the philosophy in the background. How do you actually get teams motivated about embedding sustainability into your projects, and what are the key things to think about when kind of looking to the future in terms of like resiliency of the web, and how does it impact users and accessibility and kind of human factors as well. So that's available now as a printed or an ebook. And then finally, the Business Declares Digital Declutter Toolkit, which we've been working with Business Declares on for a little while now, and is really exciting. You can visit it online at the moment. We'll put the link in the chat. It's already online. It's not officially launched, so we're not sharing it too widely, but you guys can go and access the content. And it's really a starting point for companies to start thinking about their holistic digital impact, and how does that fit into their kind of broader sustainability mission. So looking at like an introduction to how IT hardware has an impact, video calls and streaming, which is obviously a big thing now, apps, emails, websites, cloud storage, digital marketing, giving an introduction to all of those key things that most businesses are doing on some level, but don't necessarily think about what the environmental impact of that is. So we're trying to give an introduction to that, suggest some key actions and some pointers to resources where you can go and find more. And this is really like an emerging field, like unlike things like flights and train travel and energy, office energy use, digital emissions are very much something that hasn't been looked at much at all until the last few years. And so what we're hoping to do over time is flesh this out with more detailed information about how you can actually calculate the emissions. At the moment, there's a lot of unknowns, but it provides you with a really handy starting point and actions that you can take. So go and take a look at that, and hopefully you'll get inspired to dig into some of these areas and take action. Thanks, Sam, for sharing the link. And that's the end of my second presentation. Feel free to contact me with the details on the screen. I'll put them in the chat as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tom. Wow, there's a lot in there. I love the idea of the way that you talk about balancing the user journey versus the energy and the environmental impact, and the way that you make the point that actually you don't have to sacrifice the user journey. In fact, you can enhance the user journey.
Absolutely.
And therefore enhance the website without actually compromising success, I guess, and at the same time being good for the environment. I will never look at pictures on the web again after your presentation, particularly donkeys, so thank you for that. And I also love the way that you brought the kind of social element in as well by churning through data on that autoplay, something I've never even considered, but clearly you have, and I love that angle that you brought in there as well. So thank you for that. Just let me remind everyone, questions please in the chat, and we'll pick up on those in a second. I wonder if we could we go back to you now, and I'll just go back in time to earlier, and hope that you are.
I am here now. Sorry about that.
Pick up. That's all right.
So the last time that happened was when I was talking at a conference in November. Brilliant. I don't know what it is about, and I joked about it at the beginning when we were prepping. I went, oh yeah, the internet's usually pretty good. I run a weekly podcast, and it literally never drops out, and it's so apologies to everyone for that. I understand where I dropped off. Lib thankfully has allowed me, and I think it'd be helpful for other businesses to understand the journey and steps we're going through to get to net zero. We're in the business of helping other organizations to become more sustainable, so it's important to lead by example. So how do we do it? Firstly, becoming a B Corp completely changes the way an organization does business. It helped us put in a really good foundation to grow as we are now, and putting it towards the future. It forces you to look at everything from your environmental impact through to how you engage with your colleagues. We're a living wage employee. We allocate 1 day a month for staff to do pro bono work for a charity of their choice. It was really important that charities get the benefit from people working for them. And transparency is hugely important to us. For example, we all know each other's earnings and each other's salaries. It would be totally hypocritical if we didn't walk the walk. So we are on the road to net zero through a variety of certifications and processes. To put it simply, the real net zero is what we need to get to by 2050, meaning that greenhouse gas emissions through humankind's activities will equal zero. To help us get there, we've signed up to science-based targets. We were one of the first organizations to do that back in 2018, to reduce our emissions in line with the Paris Agreement of keeping global warming within 1.5 degree increase. And we've had our targets verified as well by the Science Based Targets Initiative. We signed up to the Race to Zero, a UN campaign aiming at tackling climate change, and again, to stay within that 1.5 degrees. We have ISO 14001, which is an environmental management system certified by an external company. And this helps to manage and reduce our impact through calculating our own carbon footprints and all of our emissions, and keeping that environmental impact to a minimum. We are a small business, so therefore we're not necessarily totally bound by environmental regulation. We do this because we genuinely care about our impact and want to keep on track with climate science. It's taken us since 2015, when we became a B Corp, to produce an impact report, for example. I mean, we're not doing it for that marketing potential, probably much to the horror of the people who work in marketing for us. One of the things that's been really effective with our learnings is the weekly podcast we have, interviewing people from lots of different organizations and finding out what others do. It's the reason why we set up the podcast in the first place, as a learning resource for all of us who are running organizations and working in organizations. What is it that we can do? Over the last 3 years, you can now listen to industry specific organizations, so you can actually have a look and see if your industry is in there, and see what other people in your industry are doing in order to help you become more environmental. If we could go to the next step, please. Ben, could you press play for the demo, and I'll just speak over it. Thank you. So to get started, you really need to measure your carbon footprint. One of the most effective ways for your organization to become more sustainable is to measure and reduce the carbon footprint of your operations and business activities. From our experience, many businesses would love to green up, but are held back by the financial and time barriers of hiring costly environmental consultants. This is particularly true for smaller organizations. We went on a mission to significantly reduce the cost and time spent on measuring an organization's carbon footprint, encouraging them to spend more time and money on actually reducing that impact. This is why we set up Compare Your Footprint. It's a comprehensive online carbon calculation and benchmarking tool. We want to demystify carbon footprint and enable anyone in an organization with access to electricity, gas, travel, waste and water, materials use info, to be able to generate a carbon footprint results instantly without the need for costly consultants. You can also benchmark your organization, which we find is incredibly useful for organizations because they want to see how they fare against their competitors. If we could go on to the next slide, please, Ben. So how can we help SMEs? I'm a small business owner, and so understanding the challenges we face to get the day-to-day work done builds the business and meets bigger picture needs such as climate change. Whatever your business is, wherever it's on its carbon journey, whatever size, we believe no company should be left behind. This is why we are on a mission to make the road to carbon reductions smoother for SMEs. We published a white paper in collaboration with the University of Edinburgh Business School last year to highlight both the challenges and opportunities faced by SMEs looking to become greener. We're sharing the link to the report in the chat now. As you can see, becoming more environmental is not just great for the planet, it's great for business. It goes beyond a tick box exercise. You only have to see the large global chains publicizing their net zero strategies to see there's been a massive shift from a nice to have to a must have in the business world. We're on a mission to help businesses like yours, so our fees are based on your turnover. We offer our tool for free if your turnover is under 300,000, or at a very good rate if it's higher. Fellow B Corps receive 20% discount too. We also offer loads of free guidance on how to reduce your impact and have recently launched Sustainability Solved, our online community. Let us know if you do want to have an invite to that. We've also written a homeworking white paper that helps you understand what it is that you can do at this current new normal and how you're able to reduce it. And there are a number of things that you're able to do, which Tom also touched upon in his previous slides. Next slide, please, Ben. thank you for listening today. Sorry about the hiccup at the beginning. If you've got any questions at all about that measurement and what to do, please do give us a shout whenever you want to.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Will. I loved the passion. I love the authenticity, and I love the idea of sharing earnings and salary. And was just wondering how that would work in lots of other organisations. So a very brave move, but a very, as I say, authentic and open one. I also like this idea of fees based on turnover, which means that your tool is accessible to lots of organisations who really just don't know where to start and can't even get their heads around it. So you've got a great solution there. So thank you very much for that. Okay, we are well in time, and so please keep your questions coming in the chat function. What I'd like to do now is move on to our last speaker. Our last speaker is Reem Valendi. She is the founder and CEO of Offset Go. Oops, hang on, I've got my slides out of sync. Let's just move on to there. So Reem, founder of Offset Go. This is an early stage startup offering carbon management solutions for distributed workspaces, virtual events, and online learning. So Reem, and a massive thank you, especially for you. Please do tell us what time it is where you are, just so you can get everybody's empathy as well. But over to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm calling from Montreal in Canada, and it's 6:37 a.m. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this event and to join a community of like-minded companies, all fighting the same fight for climate change. So a bit of background on myself. I'm a sustainability consultant focused on the urban part. Within the urban context, I've been working in the field of green building for many years now, probably 20 or so. And I have a consultancy company called Medina Works. And I've also been involved quite significantly in working with startups in the Middle East and North Africa region where I'm from. So during the COVID lockdown, I started thinking about what will be the impact of more and more companies transitioning to remote working and spending more and more time working and collaborating via tools like this, like Zoom and others. As someone who kind of comes from the urban sustainability world, I started thinking about the physical workplace, which is the home office, but also started learning from people like Tom and others about what does that mean, this digital footprint as well. And I thought we need a solution, a very easy solution for companies who have a team that is completely remote or hybrid mode to actually be able to capture that. So if we move to the next two slides, in a way, the workplace is increasingly distributed, and the next slide is every inch or square inch and bit of climate action will actually count, especially the number is increasing. More and more companies are transitioning, if not to remote, to hybrid mode. And in the knowledge sector and companies like we're talking about here who are producing digital products and services, this is especially relevant. So if we go to the next slide, please. In order to evaluate a company's carbon footprint, most companies will probably use the greenhouse gas protocol, which includes which would cover three main scopes. The scope number one, which is really linked to the direct emissions of a company, linked to their facilities, their vehicles, etc. And scope two, which is about what electricity and other fuels they're purchasing actually for their own use. This scope one and scope two is what most companies who are doing carbon accounting would consider. The reason is also because they consider it more direct, easier to get also in terms of information because it's somewhat under their control. And other companies are increasingly looking at scope three as well, which is the indirect emissions, everything else that involves more stakeholders like employee commute or supply chain or business travel, etc. And there's a push for more and more companies to also cover this part as well, which tends to be hard to capture. Now, if we move to the next slide and we think about a remote company, the middle part kind of disappears if we follow the standards by the letter, right? And it wouldn't be right to ignore, other indirect emissions that are actually being created in the homes of the employees. And that's what I'm trying to show in the third slide. In the next slide, basically our office is becoming this network of home offices. They're all connected to electricity and they're all consuming potentially other fuels like natural gas for heating, etc. They produce waste as well, etc. So if we take the same principle that we address offices in when a company has its own space, its own workplace, we could look at it in the same way, but in the distributed network of home offices. And this is exactly, next slide, what we're trying to do at OffsetGo. We're trying to help digital-first organizations track, reduce, and offset greenhouse gas emissions in the distributed workplace. And our current approach, which we're still testing because we're still an early stage company, is what I'm trying to show in the next slide. First of all, we want companies to actually start with a commitment. Think of it like when you're taking public transport, you actually top up your Oyster card before you even use public transport. Why not have a system in place that a company could actually pledge a certain tonnage of carbon offsets per remote desk or per employee or per full-time equivalent to get started with climate action? After all, it's an emergency, and we need to take action as quick as possible. So we're proposing that this would be a first step in joining OffsetGo as a company, and that the next step, which I show in the next slide, is really to start getting to use our tools. The main tool that we're proposing is focused on the home office, which is a combination in a way of the physical workplace. And I saw a question earlier about what percentage should I use. If you think of it maybe in a simpler way, if you take the whole home office, if you take the whole home, as a residential use, and we're trying to capture an element of that home, which is for commercial use within that home. So technically, we would take into consideration the portion of energy use of that home for the specific square footage that represent the home office, but we would only take into account energy end uses that apply to commercial activity. So heating, cooling, lighting, but probably not hot water and probably not appliances, for instance. So that's how we would approach it as part of our methodology. We're trying to apply basically building science to this part of the calculation. And we try to also take into account the life cycle assessment portion and the embodied energy of the physical space as well. For the digital part, you've heard it already from Tom. If you think of someone who's spending 8 hours a day plugging maybe a laptop and a screen and an external microphone and a sound system, etc., the power usage the time is what we would take into account and when we talk about devices, but also we're connected to a network which has also its own energy use per data traffic that we're actually moving around. For example, now doing this video conference, we're sending some data and receiving as over the time period of this event. So taking into account network and data energy is also as important, and this is something we have included as part of the methodology to tackle what we call the distributed emissions. Next slide, please. So the idea is that because we're considering the home office as the territory where we're trying to reduce carbon emissions, in a way, this is a territory where the interest of the employer and the employees meet. If we reduce energy use in the home, it's cost savings to the employee, but also carbon savings to the companies that they work for. And we're trying to see what solution can we propose as part of Offset Go that would help do that. So these would be solutions to reduce the carbon footprint of a company by deploying smart home solutions, energy efficiency solutions, transition also to renewable energy, like Tom was suggesting earlier with his company, to help companies reduce their impact. And with the next step, obviously, after tracking and reducing emissions, what's left is what is in the next slide, is to how do we actually offset the remaining of our carbon footprint with high quality verifiable carbon credits. What we are proposing to offer on Offset Go is carbon credit that mainly focus on projects that have high potential to really move the needle when it comes to climate change. And we're relying on the research of Project Drawdown, which is a research organization based in the US that has done some extensive work assessing about 100 solutions or so that could really have high impact on improving the situation with the climate if they were deployed at scale. And we're focusing only on the top 10, which mainly include, there includes a number of things, but forest management, clean energy, and community projects such as improved cook stoves is one of the things that they suggest as high potential. So we're trying to really focus our choices and curate only carbon credits that focus on that. We're hoping that a solution like Offset Go really can mobilize as many distributed workplaces as possible. And as conclusion, basically, we think given the number of us working remotely now during the pandemic, and I know many companies after this kind of experiment saw that we are, we're finding, working remotely potentially maybe more productive or more convenient or less costly, etc., that we can capture the potential of all these remote desks to hopefully offer, a significant and sizable climate solution. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Reem. That was great. I love the idea of us thinking much more about this home office, and rather than just we're cocooned in a room working from home and then we go off and do something else. Actually, we are part of this distributed workforce that has a responsibility to the environment, and we need to think about what that means for us. I also like the idea of the pledge per desk, a little bit similar to the carbon tax that I think Tom talked about earlier. And I think there's a real mileage in getting companies to actually perhaps sign up to something like that, and that's something that I'll definitely want to explore and look to take forward. And actually, there's a lot about mindset in here, isn't there? It's like everything that you're using. I'm looking at my laptop now, and this is one of the questions that I want to put to our speakers. My laptop has embedded carbon. These ear things have embedded carbon. The leads have embedded carbon. The desk and the chair I'm sat on have embedded carbon. And what I wanted to ask the speakers, and perhaps I'll start with Tom for your view, is where are we on that? Where are we on measuring that lot of stuff? And how do we get our heads around doing that? Because that's surely a big part of the equation, in addition to maybe it's part of scope 3, but I don't think people really perhaps think about the embedded carbon of the everyday stuff that they're using. And I'm just trying to work out, how would I even go about trying to measure that? Let's get a view from Tom first, and then I'll go to Reem and Will.
Sure. So the big stuff, like you're buying a new laptop or a monitor or something like that, or a mobile phone, most of that somewhere on the manufacturer's website, they will actually normally have a report where they actually show you the breakdown of the lifetime emissions and how much is manufacturing, transport, and usage. So it's a time thing that you've got to spend the time hunting around for it, but most of that information is there. and we do that for appliances. But also the flip side of that is you can reduce the emissions of manufacturing new equipment by buying refurbished equipment, and that's something that I think businesses need to look at a lot more, because there's a huge amount of equipment gets tossed out because it's not the latest thing, but actually there's a lot of kind of good secondhand equipment available. But the challenge we've had, which I highlighted in my first presentation, was that like when you get down to the small stuff, so like you mentioned your headphones, or you just bought a new mouse or something like that, that information might be somewhere, but companies tend to be less vigilant about publishing that data about smaller products. And then it's a bigger time sink for you, because there's you buy more small products than you do big ones. And so you end up having to hunt around a lot more. And that's why we've really struggled with the small stuff. And I know that that's kind of a bit of a hole in our kind of emissions reporting.
There's a number of organizations. There's a number of organizations that are out there to help you with that process, though. I think there's ethical. I'm going to be really rubbish at naming a load, but if you Google it, there's a number like Ethical Supermarket, and we had Buy Me Once, Tara Button, on, for example, and she highlights the best things to buy that will last the longest, and they've got to have a high number of years, like 10 years guarantee and stuff like that. So there are organizations out there to help us with what it is that we should be purchasing.
And I think Will just highlighted something really important there, which is that whether they admit it or not, hardware manufacturers do design their products to break after a time slightly more than the warranty period. So that's their business model, is make you buy a new one in 3 years, 4 years. So so the longer the length of the warranty really makes a big difference in the actual lifetime emissions impact, and all the other impacts of like materials and water usage in manufacturing and so on. So long warranties are really a good thing to look at.
And related to that, I mean, there are a number of organizations, especially non-profit, who would take on actually old devices and give them a new life, notably, I mean, we work with Veki, for example, which is an organization that refurbishes old computer and loads them with educational content and offer them to refugee children in the Middle East to help them, access an alternative education. That's an example of how you could do it. In terms of embodied energy data, on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website, actually, there's a whole section on life cycle databases, such as Athena Institute and others. So there you can find really, a long list of resources where you might find the information you need.
Thank you. That was a really interesting discussion, and I will now start looking at packaging on everything and see whether I can find stuff. But this idea of refurbishing, clearly using companies like, I know, Ethical Consumer to see what is recommended from that perspective. But also this Athena, I think you said, institute that lists stuff out with regard to this. So again, stuff that I'm definitely going to take away from there. There was one question also, Reem, to you as well. I wasn't clear whether you have any active offset projects, and if you do, and if so, do you have estimates of carbon sequestration so companies can check performance? Do you want to just say a little bit about that?
As I said, like, we are an early stage company. I mean, the company is 4 months old and we're still building a number of components. We're starting, like many of you have started, with some quick wins, and we're actually using Pachama, which is a company in the US that is providing high quality forestry project, and that provides a really interesting layer of transparency, because they use a number of tracking systems using satellite imagery, drones, etc., to actually track progress of these forest projects. So it's kind of a great way to get started. This is one example we're starting with, but we'll be looking also at other options as well to offer as well.
Yeah, okay, thank you. All right, there's quite a lot of links and important information in the chat, so if I would definitely encourage people to have a look at that. One question that's been raised and probably answered, but I'd just like to highlight it, is the proportion of an employee's home energy allocating to work, and the the sort of percentage of 20 sounds sensible. You know, Will, from your experience, Will, how do you get to 20, and do our other speakers have a different number?
We got to it because that's what the government highlight, that you're allowed to expense your energy,
Right.
and
Okay.
it seemed like a logical way to do it. If the government allow you to, if you work from home, to use 20% of your bills and offset your tax with it, then why not actually apportion 20% full stop? It's really hard. I mean, unless you actually have a sub-meter, if you're in a shed in the garden, or if you don't overcomplicate it. I think what we have a really good habit of doing as human beings is overcomplicating things. Just get cracking, start monitoring, and then maybe complicate it as you go on, because you'll understand more.
Yeah. Okay.
And we're trying to make it easier for you with the Offset Go. I mean, the way we look at it in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, there's a component in Scope 3 for leased assets, which is if you were to actually lease space at somebody else's. They have a methodology for this. We took that as kind of an inspiration point, or as a basis for our approach, but then thought to ourselves, if you are actually leasing an office, that's commercial building. But then if we're considering a residential building, there are things that we shouldn't be accounting for, things like the energy used for hot water or for appliances, etc. So in our methodology, we take the full energy use of the house. We reduce the things that are not applicable. We add the things that came in as a plus, like the digital, plugging in more computers and more, etc. And then we apportion that to the area of the home office. So for those who have a specific area, then you can do it as a percentage. And if someone is actually kind of floating and working in different areas in the office, you could make an assumption on a certain percentage or a certain area. So that's the approach we use.
Okay, so that's a more I guess detailed method to look at that bottom up, as opposed to the 20 that's come from some government guidance. And Tom, where do you sit on this question?
Yeah, I mean, generally we default, like Will said, to the sort of the 20% as a simple way. We've actually, I mean, Will's right. I think starting simple and getting more detailed as you go on makes sense. We sort of did it the other way, where we started really complicated and gradually tired ourselves out and simplified it over time. So we started out actually trying to calculate what the difference was in energy consumption on a day that somebody worked at home versus the day they didn't work at home. But you've got to take into account weather and behavior patterns, and it's really complicated. And then we looked at and we do still do this for some of our employees if they want to provide data of actually, if they've got a dedicated room that is just for work, what is the percentage of their home that room represents? That's kind of an in-between step. But as I said earlier, there's also an issue of just gathering data, because it's people's homes, it's not actually part of the business. So I think keeping it simple as 20% is definitely a great default.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I did want to explore that, because pretty much every company I'm talking to is asking that question, and it's a big one to think about. We've got some other questions. Let me just have a look at those. One of them is the use of this notion of exporting electrical goods overseas, and when we finish with them, either because they don't meet our emission standards or some other reason, we just put them somewhere else, and they carry on being used there. I guess there's a sort of trade-off between not creating a new, although better, one versus versus running one that's inefficient and polluting. I wonder where people stand on that kind of concept of keeping the old diesel car that's keeping going versus the new green battery car, and likewise, as I said in this question, getting rid of the old trucks into some other part of the world to get them off of your carbon balance sheets, that kind of concept. Reem, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think as a general rule for me is like when we have certain assets or goods, we have to give them the longest life possible to use. I mean, otherwise we're going to create, you know, a new product equivalent or a new service or whatever. And then in shipping and you know, exporting things, we always have many like various options. We could ship, you know, by road, by air, by sea, etc. And that's where we try to reduce and minimize that as much as possible. So in the case of the example I mentioned earlier of the company, of the nonprofit that we use to kind of extend the life of the digital devices, they do all their shipping by sea, and you know, these containers are going there anywhere, and they use a portion of that container to use it. So it seems like as a sensible way to go about it.
Yeah, okay, so keep that asset going as long as it's humanly possible seems to be your stance. Is that something that Will and Tom you'd agree with? You're nodding there, Tom.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a key difference between like IT equipment and vehicles, in the sense that actually a much bigger proportion of the life cycle energy of an IT product is in the manufacture compared to the usage, because they're relatively energy efficient to use, like smartphones, laptops, things like that.
Yeah.
But they take a lot of energy to manufacture. So keeping them going as long as possible just does make a lot of sense for this type of product. And the other thing is that the energy efficiency gains from like one generation to the next of IT equipment is sort of plateauing out. It's not that big anymore. You know, if you go back 10 years, the new laptop might be way more energy efficient than the old one, but actually now laptops and phones and so on are so efficient that the actual incremental gain of the next one isn't really big enough to justify throwing away the old one. It's much better to keep things going for a long time.
Yeah.
There's a rule of thumb in vehicles, isn't there? That's a third in manufacture, a third in use, and a third in disposal for the carbon emissions. And I know that's slightly different for electric. I mean, we're in it's so multi-dimensional because you've got, you can't have one size that fits all. And we've also got to realize we're also in a transitional period. So therefore, possibly electric vehicle for you would be beneficial, but then possibly for someone else not. And we've also got to remember that batteries are a finite resource, and we, you know, I don't think it is just one size fits absolutely all on this.
Yeah, it depends on the usage patterns as well. You know, for a device that gets used a lot, then obviously the manufacturing impact becomes smaller relative to the usage. So looking at how things are going to be used is important, but again, you can get lost in the detail.
I remember we got asked years ago by a company, Firefish, who they emailed and said, so we've been thinking about this, we've got to buy a new photocopier, and we can't work out whether we should be buying a second-hand one, we should get a black and white one, and they had a series of options. And I wrote back to them and said, the fact that you are asking these questions is actually the best point that you could be. It's actually just starting to ask those questions. It's what is it that fits you as an organization? And if you're asking the pertinent questions, then you're actually probably on the right track.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I just want to see if there's anyone in the audience that wants to come in with a question, so you don't have to keep listening to me. I'll just flick around my screen here. If anyone does want to ask, would you like to come off mute and just jump in? If not, I've got another question. Okay, I'll take your silence as a no, but please do shout out. So last question from my side, and then we will see if there are any final ones in the chat or people want to come in. So I was listening to the chief executive of a mining company this morning, and he got asked, you know, you're extracting, and as somebody has rightly said, we have a finite amounts of precious metals which go into batteries for things like electric cars or even storage batteries for electricity. And how do you stand on that? And he said, well, in order to do a green recovery, a green economy, we need to build the green infrastructure which will enable that. And I was struck by Tom's pictures of the solar panels, which didn't come off for you, Tom, but that was where you were heading. And I was thinking, well, what about all of the precious metals that go into that? And where is this tipping point between getting really green with everything, because we've got solar here and reusable there, but we've just depleted the entire Earth's natural resources, which is going to cause a knock-on effect. And that dichotomy that we're living in at the minute strikes me as one that's I certainly don't know what the answer is, and I'd be really interested in people's views on the call. Not just our speakers, by the way, but people in the audience. If you want to come in either on the chat or verbally. But to get the ball rolling, Will, where's your head at with this dichotomy between extraction for green and ecocide and ecological breakdown, which is a consequence of it?
If I'm honest, I don't really have one, and I think that's a bit of a cop-out, that I think it's because it's so complicated, and I don't think we could solve this problem on a 10-second call. Look at every single thing in its individual items. Really is all I can say.
Okay.
Sorry, I know that's a complete cop-out.
It was a difficult question, to be fair. Tom, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think we have to be realistic about the fact that there are no perfect solutions. But ultimately, we've got to get off fossil fuels. We've got to decarbonize the society. And so all of that infrastructure has to be built at some point. The sooner you build it, the faster you get off fossil fuels. So the long-term impact is going to be less if you do it sooner. But also, I think the other side of this is like energy reduction, because the more you can reduce energy consumption, the less infrastructure you have to build. And I think I know people have been talking about energy efficiency for decades, but yet like global energy consumption keeps going up and we keep using more and more of it. And I think that in itself is a big problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And Reem?
Yeah, I would agree with Tom on this. I think, the faster we get out of the fossil fuel and decarbonize is our priority. And I think the idea is, how do we do it in the most efficient way possible and optimize the use of these resources available to us. I believe there's somebody raising their hand also, they want to intervene.
Oh, sorry, I can't see that. Whoever's raising your hand, do you want to come in?
It's Simon, I think.
Yeah, it's me. Tom sort of partly answered what I was going to say to your question, just to throw into the mix, really. The key is cutting energy use is an absolute priority. It's the old, Carbon Britain Carbon Zero 2030, the Central Alternative Technologies book and mantra. Power down is the absolute priority. Cut our energy use by 80%. That then gives us a chance to actually then utilize the renewables to their maximum. And as Tom said, we don't need quite as much infrastructure, but we do need some infrastructure, and that's vital. Also, we don't have to be too, we have to think about breaking some sort of taboos, as it were. I mean, we're talking about batteries and lithium. There are now mining companies looking at the serious deposits of lithium in Cornwall, and this will create lots of jobs in Cornwall. And the real risk is that organisations like CPRE and countryside campaigners and holiday home owners will campaign against the use of local lithium. And so that there's some quite sort of brutal questions that need to be addressed, I think, when we're looking at that. And also the other point is, I don't think there's either or when it comes to tackling climate change. We need to grasp every opportunity. Don't pick one. There's no one silver bullet for any of this. and that is a crucial thing to remember. And it also goes back to your personal lives as well. You know, in the UK, you know, your own home is a massive source of carbon emissions because most of it's heated by gas. But at the moment, with the interest rates so low, you probably get a better return on investing in energy efficiency in your house than you will in an ISA or virtually anything on the stock market. You can get a return of between 5 and 16% on your capital of investing in the energy efficiency of your home. And it's something that home workers need to seriously think about. I mean, the governor of the Bank of England announced, was it last week, that there's £125 billion in personal savings sitting in bank accounts at the moment. And I, for one, don't want to see that spent on overseas holidays and lots more beer and eating out. I think it should be spent on improving the energy performance of your house, because what better offer to the next generation is passing on a house that is super energy efficient.
Brilliantly well put.
Thank you. That was there's a lot in there. I thought we might be going down the route of consumption versus GDP and jobs for there, but that's probably a webinar for another day, Simon. So, but thank you for nudging that little bit of agenda. And yeah, the ROI on home energy, I hadn't really thought of that angle at all. But again, that's a really great concept. What I'm going to do is, there aren't any other questions, so I am going to ask each of our speakers just to give a 30-second thought piece from today. What's the thing that you would like the people on this call to take away and remember you by? Reem, over to you. Reem, over to you.
Well, thank you everyone for being here and for accepting someone from outside also to be part of your call. I learned a lot from all the speakers today and also from the questions. The more I look at it, I'm seeing potential integration of various solutions here to offer like a comprehensive tool to companies like the ones involved here in Tech Nation to get them to net zero even faster. So my word, I guess, that I want to close with is how can we all collaborate, you know, to move this even faster and make an even bigger impact.
Fantastic. Collaboration for speed. Will?
Just measure your footprint. Simple as that. Just start measuring it. The tools are out there. Just start doing it. It'll help you reduce. What you don't measure, you don't. What is it? You don't measure, you don't. You
manage.
don't. Yeah, you don't manage. That's the one. Thanks, Ben.
You're welcome. Okay, fantastic. And Tom?
I would say start looking at the digital side of carbon emissions in addition to all the other things. It's very much early days, and I think nobody has all the answers in terms of what to do or how to account for digital emissions, but ultimately it's one of the fastest growing sources of energy consumption globally. And those of us in the tech industry are kind of in a prime position to help do something about it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So just to summarize the in reverse order, so you know, looking at the digital side, we are increasingly digital, and we will become more so with home working, and today has highlighted in very detailed areas as to where one might look for and how one might think about that. Measure it so you can manage it, as the old adage is, and to have that mindset of actually everything I'm doing has a carbon footprint, everything I'm doing right now, and how can I think about what that footprint is. And then back to Reem's first point when she came in is around collaborate for speed. So on that perfect segue, Business Declares is all about collaboration, and what I would just like to leave you with, if I can just get this slide up there, is this one here. If you would like to collaborate with us, through us, with networks like this, with networks like others, please contact myself or Sam. There's the numbers, and there are the the various email addresses. So I will leave that up there for a few more seconds. Can I have a massive, massive thank you to our three speakers, Tom, Will and Reem. Can I do a massive thank you for Sammy for setting this up in the first place and encouraging everybody to attend. And a massive thank you for all the audience to giving up your time. Giving up time at the minute is something that's quite a big ask. There are millions of webinars going on every single minute of the day, and I don't underestimate when you're looking at these things, go, am I really going to give up my time for that one? But I hope you found this insightful. I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you can take away stuff from here which you can go back when you turn your PC down and think, actually, I'm going to look at this in a different way. And I certainly have taken an awful lot from here. So really appreciate that. Have a great day, everybody, and a great rest of the week, and look forward to catching up with maybe some of you later. Take care. See you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.